Hello, this is a Moog DFAM. I was asked about a year ago to do a deep dive on it, so better late than never. Moog released these quite a few years ago. I bought mine as soon as they hit the shelves, so this video isn't really that timely, but I hope there's something in it that will inspire you to explore this great little instrument further. After I started this video, I realized it's gonna have to be another series. So in part one of my DFAM deep dive, I'm going to go into a lot of detail about the oscillators and the hardwired modulation associated with them. I'll talk a little bit about performing and playing the DFAM. That's really what it was made for and really where it shines. But I'm going to save a lot of my performance tricks and ideas for the last videos of the series after we've covered everything else. But I will do a quick overview of the layout and features of the DFAM, and then I'll get into detail about the oscillators. And at the end, I'll walk through 3 patches based off ideas covered in this video. As always, there's an index in the description and links to other videos and patch diagrams as well. I'll play around with it for a little bit, then there'll be a quick preview of the patches we'll be working on later in the video before we get into the technical talk. Okay, let's start with a quick overview of the DFAM's basic controls, starting with the voice architecture. So we've got 2 voltage-controlled oscillators, which are switchable between square and triangle waves. Oscillator 2 can be hard synced to oscillator 1 by this little switch over here. The oscillators are internally routed to the mixer, where we have individual volume controls for each oscillator as well as the noise generator. The noise generator on the DFAM is white noise. Out of the mixer, we go into the filter. The filter is a 4-pole ladder or a 12 dB per octave slope filter. Not going to get into too much detail about filter slopes. 4-pole is the most commonly used on Moog synths. And of course, there's a little switch here that will switch between high-pass and low-pass filters. And of course, we also have resonance control. Out of the filter, we go to the VCA. Keep in mind the DFAM was designed as a percussive synth, so it doesn't have the standard envelope controls. Moog has given us just what we need. The VCA envelope generator has 2 modes for attack, slow and fast. Fast is a 1 millisecond attack time, perfect for most percussive sounds. But if you want to emulate something like a gong or a soft mallet, the slow attack time, which I believe is around 100 milliseconds, is great for that. So the VCA envelope's attack time is either slow or fast, but we have a knob to control the decay time over here. On to the filter envelope generator. Again, no control over attack. It's the same as the fast setting on the VCA envelope, 1 millisecond. And like the VCA, we have a knob to control the filter decay time. And of course, we also have control of the amount of envelope filter modulation with this knob here. In the center position, or 12 o'clock, we've got 0 modulation with positive and negative values either clockwise or counterclockwise. The VCF mod amount / noise knob controls the amount of filter modulation. If there's nothing patched into the VCF mod CV input, the filter is modulated by the white noise generator. In the manual, they say that's good for lo-fi noises. Okay, back to the oscillators. Let's take a look at the modulation options. If you've ever created any sort of percussive patch before from scratch, you'll know how important it is to have some VCO modulation. The VCOs are modulated by, yet again, another envelope generator. And like the other envelope generators on the DFAM, the attack time is set at 1 millisecond. But like the other envelope generators, we do have VCO envelope decay time. There's individual controls for VCO envelope generator modulation amount, both positive and negatives, just like the VCF for each of the oscillators. Oscillator 1 can modulate the frequency of oscillator 2 using its triangle wave. It's always the triangle wave that is used for FM, regardless of the position of the wave switch for oscillator 1. The amount of FM is controlled by the knob over here. And of course, we've got a 2-lane 8-step sequencer hardwired to pitch and velocity. This switch assigns the pitch sequencer to either both oscillators, just oscillator 2, or neither. The velocity sequencer affects all the envelope generators on the DFAM, which provides dynamic variations to both amplitude or volume and decay. And of course, we have our tempo control knob for the sequencer over here. And lastly, a trigger button if you just want to do one-shots. Oh, I almost forgot the most important part. There's 24 CV patch points, 15 inputs, and 9 outputs, which I'll get into in more detail later on. So that about covers everything. Time to get extra nerdy. All right, let's start by taking a closer look at the oscillators. So we're going to start by checking out the wave shapes. So I'm going to patch wave out directly into my scope. And there we have it, a beautiful triangle wave. And let's check out the square. The square is obviously quite a bit louder than the triangle. That's pretty normal. There's a lot more harmonic content in a square wave. All right, let's check out the range of the oscillators. So if we go all the way clockwise, you're increasing the frequency or raising the pitch. And it looks like we're getting up to a D-sharp 8 on the keyboard. And if we go counterclockwise, we're out of audio range. Like, we're not hearing that as a pitch anymore. So that's kind of acting as an LFO. So that's good news. We could use our oscillators as LFOs if we wanted to. You know what? We might as well try that out. Square LFO is probably most commonly used as a gate or trigger. So I'm going to use this mult cable patch into our scope as well as the trigger input on the DFAM. So let's see if this works. Yep, there we go. So our oscillator is triggering the DFAM. So we could use this as a second clock source for the DFAM or for something else in our synth rig. But the slowest is not that slow, but we can fix that by offsetting the pitch with the sequencer if we want. So as you saw, I switched the sequencer to control oscillator 2, and now I'm turning down the pitch on the step we're on. And yeah, we're way slower. So there's our trigger. The DFAM will only trigger on the rise of the wave. There's our fall, no trigger. So we got to wait for our next rise. There it is. Yeah, that's pretty slow. And because it's so easy to modulate, the pitch of that oscillator could be fun for some crazy clock signals. Okay, so I've just switched over to triangle wave, and you can see that we're no longer getting a triangle wave. We're getting a weird sort of shark fin type wave, which is very similar to a logarithmic exponential envelope. So I'm using that to modulate the VCA now. So I guess in a pinch, the oscillators could also be used as clocked envelope generators, which is pretty cool. And just want to remind you that the shape has been altered by the sequencer. That's why we're getting these waves. All right, let's check out probably the most important thing, the VCO modulation. So I'm going to patch the VCO envelope out into our scope so we can see it. Okay, that's a weird shape. It's getting clipped at the top. So I'm going to patch out of the VCA envelope generator so we can compare the two. And as you can see, it's not clipping anymore. For some reason, it will clip when you use the trigger, but not the sequencer. So let's slowly turn up the VCO modulation amount. And you can hear it's getting way snappier. And let me show you again, actually, just with the trigger, how that will affect the sound. So we're getting that clip again. So because it's clipping, you'll hear the pitch that the envelope is taking the oscillator to. So that's kind of neat. Again, the envelope clipping only happens with the trigger. If it really bothers you and you want to use one-shots or something, you can obviously use the filter to take out that high pitch. We'll talk more about the filter later, though. Okay, let's go back to the sequencer and we'll mess around a little bit more with the VCO envelope decay this time. So I'm bringing up the amount just to about 2 o'clock, and we'll slowly increase the decay. And you can hear how that's really affecting the sound. Now it sounds like a kick drum. Now we're getting into weirdo space toms. And you can see if it's all the way up, the pitch never falls all the way down to the original pitch. You can see that clearly on the scope. The envelope is so long, it's almost a static CV, or acting as an offset almost. So the most obvious use for these extreme VCO envelopes is obviously tom sounds. You could do that by manually modulating the VCO decay, or we could use a CV input and modulate the VCO envelope amount. All right, let's just go back to good old basic kick sound, which the DFAM is awesome at doing. Nice, that's a good start. All right, so as we know, DFAM is short for drummer from another mother. I think a bunch of people go out and buy these things thinking they'll be a good substitute for a traditional drum machine, but that's not the case. The DFAM is an instrument unto itself. If you expect it to behave like a drum machine or a sequencer, you'll probably be disappointed. Like all Moog instruments, you'll get the best results by actually playing the DFAM. The sequencers, which we'll go into in greater detail in another video, are best thought of, in my opinion, as 8 little hands that are quickly manipulating the sound, which of course leaves our actual hands free to play the DFAM as you would a keyboard. Of course, there's no keyboard on the DFAM, so the knobs and switches are what we'll be playing. So let's experiment with what we've talked about so far, and I'm just going to jam out a little bit and try to demonstrate what I'm talking about by playing with VCO decay time, which we do have a CV input control for, by the way, more on that later, and VCO envelope amount, which unfortunately we don't, but that of course just means we have to play it manually. Okay, I'm going to shut up so you can hear what I'm actually playing, and I'll get the sequencer going, starting with just the velocity sequencer with all knobs on full for now, and I'll play around with the VCO envelope decay and amount with Oscillator 2 as the only sound source. Cool. You can see with some practice, and I think I probably need a little bit more of that, you can get some cool sounds with just those parameters. Haven't even touched the filter yet. Let's add in the pitch sequencer. I haven't really planned anything out. We'll just see what it sounds like with the knob positions the way they are, and I'll mess around some more with the same parameters. All right, let's take a closer look at the DFAM's Oscillator hard sync. I'm going to patch both oscillator direct outs straight into the scope. I'm going to use square waves for both oscillators, easier to see what's going on. And let's just tune Oscillator 2 so they're in unison, or as close as we can get at least. Okay, close enough. Now turn on hard sync. There's a little latency with this scope, but there, now we can see it. They're locked in tune. Okay, let's do a quick recap of Oscillator Sync. I've gone into a lot more detail about this before in previous videos, but we'll just do a quick recap so you don't have to search for another video. Oscillator 1 is the master, and Oscillator 2, which is synced to Oscillator 1, is called the slave. It's probably about time to update those terms. Anyway, as the master oscillator finishes its cycle, it resets the slave oscillator. What that means is that the slave oscillator is forced to the frequency of the master. I don't want to keep saying slave and master, so let's call those follower and leader instead. We just saw that when I was setting up. The oscillators were close to being in tune, a little bit of beating, then engaged the hard sync, and they were bang on perfectly in tune. So if the follower's frequency is close enough to that of the leader, you'll get two perfectly in tune oscillators. Cool. It's when the frequency of the two oscillators is different, we get some real interesting results. Again, with hard sync, if we change the frequency of the follower, it will be forced to reset every time the leader resets. So for instance, if the frequency of the follower is higher than that of the leader, we can theoretically get equal divisions by integer. In musical terms, that means we will get harmonics or overtones. The cool thing is, though, is the frequency knobs are obviously not stepped, and it's a good thing. So we can get cool timbre changes when there's not clear divisions. That's the sound we normally associate with Oscillator Sync. In one of the videos I did about recreating the subharmonicon, I got into way more detail about Oscillator Sync and talk about using Oscillator Sync as a way to create clock multipliers, which is sort of what the subharmonicon does in a way. Anyway, back to the DFAM. If the frequency of the follower is below that of the leader, it will eventually be eliminated because the wave is forced to reset before it can complete its cycle. The cool thing is what happens in the small range before that happens. If using a square wave, this is a way you can get different pulse widths. So although the DFAM doesn't have pulse width modulation, you can get a little bit of that by using Oscillator Sync if you want. So let's get back to the DFAM and check all that out. Let's try out that pulse width mod first by lowering the frequency of the follower. Cool, and if we keep going, it'll disappear. Okay, I'm going to mute Oscillator 1 so we hear that a little bit better. Nice. Okay, let's raise the pitch of the follower now. And we're in between harmonics, so we're getting some pretty cool sounds. And as we're getting closer to equally dividing the wave, it's getting cleaner sounding. And there's our first harmonic, there's an octave. And we'll just keep going. Get some cool sounds. It's a fifth. And we're just going through the harmonic series with a bit of extra color. Cool. Now I think the sound most people associate with Oscillator Hard Sync is swooping, like that. Just modulating the pitch of the follower. And we can get that cool hard sync squelch sound. Cool, okay, so you don't need to do that manually, of course. We can use the VCO envelope to get that. Let's just bring the envelope to 0. There, it's not affecting it at all. So bring up the decay time a bit and bring up the envelope. And we're getting some squelch, maybe longer envelope. Even longer. There we go. Cool. Now we got a hard sync laser sound. Nice. Let's increase the VCA decay. That's better. Okay, and we can obviously invert the envelope as well. Let's try that. Now we're not getting anything now because the frequency of the follower is being modulated below the frequency of the leader. So we'll just crank up the frequency. There we go. And we get a rising laser beam. Cool, so there's some fun tricks with Oscillator Sync. Let's just put it back to where we started. Okay, cool. Now let's try the same thing with the sequencer. We'll just use velocity for now. Let's make sure the pitch isn't being affected. And let's just mess around in real time with the VCO EG amount. Could get some kind of cool grooves doing this. Yeah, cool. You're getting some pretty cool sounds. That's definitely worth messing around with later. But let's try the pitch sequence. So first, let's just listen to Oscillator 1. And okay, so it's fine. Just the knob positions I already had. Turn off Oscillator 1. And bring in Oscillator 2. And let's modulate the pitch of Oscillator 2, the follower. Okay, let's try some VCO EG. Works best around the midpoint. Okay, let's see what happens if we mess around with the decay time. Oh, I like that. Okay, so if we increase the decay time and keep the EG amount up pretty high, we can get some pretty crazy sounds. Analog artifacts. Weird. But sounds best around there, I think. Cool. Now, of course, you can use the negative modulation to mute the steps. That could definitely be useful in performance situations. That's cool. Okay, what are we going to try now? Let's mess around with individual sequence steps. I'm just going to jam out for a little bit and experiment with what we've just been talking about. Alright, so far we've just been listening to Oscillator 2, the follower. Let's see what happens if we modulate the pitch of both the follower and the leader. Alright, last but not least, let's take a look at the FM modulation. So once again, I'll just get the oscillators in tune. Okay. Alright, I've already done a ton of videos already about frequency modulation, so I'm not going to get into too much detail about this one. The general idea of FM is simply one oscillator is going to modulate the pitch of another oscillator. On the DFAM, it's Oscillator 1 that modulates the pitch of Oscillator 2, and regardless of the wave shape switch, it's always going to be a pulse wave which modulates the oscillator, not the triangle. So let's turn up the frequency modulation amount and see what happens. Now when the oscillators are in tune like this, you can hear that even with a ton of frequency modulation, there we go, we're getting some sounds there, but really not that much is happening. So this time we're going to adjust the frequency of oscillator 1. And it's kind of the opposite of hard sync. If the modulation wave is higher in frequency than the carrier wave, you're not really going to get too much frequency modulation. Maybe a little bit of glassy sound, some artifacts, but nothing too much. Now the magic happens when the mod wave is below the carrier wave. There we go. And if we bring it right down, we get into sort of a weird vibrato. Get kind of a weird chiptune Nintendo style vibrato. Let's see if we can dial that in. Nice. That's cool. Okay, since I got my Mother 32 right here, let's just set up a quick chiptune style patch. So gate out of the Mother 32 into the trigger input of the DFAM. We'll take keyboard CV out of the Mother into the pitch of oscillator 2. Nice. Chiptune melody. Oh, and you know what else this reminds me of? For all you Flash Gordon fans out there, we can get Ming the Merciless's magic ring sound. See if we can dial that in. Pathetic earthlings, hurling your bodies out into the void without the slightest inkling of who or what is out here. I love that movie. Okay, one thing I forgot to mention, the FM on the DFAM is exponential FM, not linear like on the Mother 32. So let's just mess around with this and just get some different sounds so you get an idea of what it sounds like. Okay, so let's do the same thing we did with the hard sync and just get the sequencer going and mess around with modulating the FM amount. Just dial in a sound I like first. Actually, that's pretty good. Let's go with that. Okay, so we've talked about oscillator wave shapes and checked out the sounds of the oscillators. We've checked out the VCO modulation and hard sync and now FM. So let's see what happens if we put that all together. Okay, I'm happy with my FM modulation sound, so let's add in some VCO modulation. We'll start with just modulating the frequency of oscillator 1. Now we're still just listening to oscillator 2, and oscillator 1 is acting as a mod wave. That's pretty cool. Alright, let's see what happens if we modulate oscillator 2. Yeah, much more aggressive. That splashy water sort of sound. Let's do a quick comparison so you can hear the difference. More percussive with oscillator 1. And splashy water with oscillator 2. But check this out, if we use negative VCO modulation on the oscillator 2, we get a more percussive sound again. Let's turn off the sequencer and just use the trigger. Cool, I like that sound a lot. There's positive modulation with the trigger. Let's make sure it's not being modulated and try the same with oscillator 1. Check this out, I want to show you this. If we do negative modulation with oscillator 1, we can get the pitch will sound and then we kind of get a bouncing ball sound afterwards. Let's see if I can dial that in. There we go. There's our bouncing ball. Nice, okay, let's get rid of that modulation, just make sure it's at 0. Okay, now I'm going to show you how to get a gong. Well, it's not really a gong, it's more of a spring sound. So a little bit less FM modulation, and oops, I'm going to go with negative modulation on oscillator 2 again. There we go, there's our spring. And if we play around with the FM amount, we'll get different pitched springs. Okay, let's get the sequencer going. And I'll just experiment with what we've just talked about for a bit. Okay, and now let's modulate the pitch of oscillator 2, our carrier wave. Now the DFAM sequencer is only 8 steps, but we can make it sound like 16 by just simply slowly modulating the FM amount. Cool, instant 16-step pattern. Let's try modulating the pitch of oscillator 1 and 2. So now the mod wave and the carrier wave are being modulated equally, so our FM sound will stay fairly consistent. So this is static modulation, and this is both of them together. More stable sound, but I think this one's got more character. Okay, now if we try to hard sync the oscillators with FM modulation, we're going to get some bizarre results. So let me show you what I mean. Okay, so let's turn off the FM for a second and dial in maybe the second partial, the fifth. So there's our hard sync with the fifth, and we'll slowly bring in the FM. As you can hear, it's not nearly as aggressive an FM sound. But what we can get is kind of a DX7 style crappy guitar sound. There we go. There's our DX7 guitar. And if we modulate the FM while we strike the note, kind of sounds like a talk box, like Peter Frampton. Now if we want a mouth harp type sound, we just use a triangle wave. Here's our weird mouth harp. Really like this sound. On to some patches. I'll start with a nice simple patch, could be used for percussive or melodic sequences. The main idea behind this patch is pulse width modulation. I'll demo the patch and then show you how to put it together. Then it's up to you to experiment, come up with something you like. Okay, first I'm going to tune the oscillators. They just have to be in tune with each other, not going to bother with a tuner. Flip on hard sync. Pitch sequencer is assigned to oscillator 2, so like we learned earlier in the video, with a hard synced oscillator we can get different pulse widths if the pitch is negatively modulated, until you cut the wave off entirely, so pitch can be used to mute a step. Okay, let's get the sequencer going and hear what it sounds like. You can hear the different timbres from the pulse width modulation. Now let's bring oscillator 1 back into the mix. With pitch sequence affecting oscillator 2's width but also causing rest, we get different rhythms from each oscillator. Cool. I'm going to patch the velocity sequence CV out to modulate the VCO decay time. Won't hear any change yet, we're not modulating any of the VCOs. Now we're going to use a negative envelope to modulate VCO1 to get some bounce. Because the oscillators are synced, it's going to affect both of them. Let's listen to oscillator 2. You can hear the VCO modulation. We get a scoop whenever velocity is low. Oscillator 1. Now I'm going to patch pitch to modulate the FM amount. With a tiny pitch increase, we get a quick snare type sound from oscillator 2, which is modulating to a higher harmonic, but still being affected by the VCO modulation. And that's it. So for performance ideas, I'd play around with both sequencer lanes. Lower velocity will cause larger scoops on oscillator 2. Negative pitch will affect timbre of oscillator 2, and positive pitch will bring in a snare. Have fun. Alright, the ratchets or multiple steps you're hearing in this patch are a result of something I mentioned earlier, using an oscillator as an LFO and using it as a gate or clock signal. As you can hear, it works pretty well. I'll play around with it for a bit, then show you how I put it together. Okay, the first step is to make sure all the steps in the pitch sequence are centered. I'm going to step through with the advance button and tune them all individually. Alright, now I'm going to assign the pitch sequencer to oscillator 2, and I've got that turned all the way counterclockwise, so it's acting like an LFO. Now I'm going to patch oscillator 2 wave out directly into the trigger input. Okay, let's dial in a hi-hat sound. I'm using white noise in high-pass mode on the filter with the filter fully clockwise. And that sounds pretty good. The pitch sequencer will control the amount of ratchets per step. All we're doing is just modulating the frequency of our LFO with the sequencer. So I'm going to move step by step through the sequence and just dial in subdivisions I think might sound good. I'm trying to tune the steps to eighths, triplets, or sixteenths. But if they're off by a little bit, it doesn't really matter because the master clock will keep the entire sequence in time somewhat. Might sound like a little wonky bit of playing, but that could end up sounding cool. You could, of course, just do what I'm doing now, create a beat by simply stepping through the sequence manually. That actually works pretty well. But let's try the sequencer. Well, it's a little drunk sounding. I'm going to do a little tinkering with those steps and try to smooth it out. And might as well do some adjustments with the velocity. That will make it sound a little bit more human, or at least more musical. Now we're getting somewhere. Sounds like a military snare drum. Okay, so for some variation in the sound, we could play with the VCA decay. You can do that in real time. But I'm going to patch the velocity out of the sequencer to do that. Whoa! Okay. That's going to need some attenuation. Now, in a lot of my videos, if you've seen them, I use these little passive attenuator mixer things by Board Brain Music called Splix, but I've got a mixer right beside the DFAM, a little happy nerding mixer, so I'm going to use that to attenuate the velocity out, and I'll patch that back into the VCA decay CV in. And we just need a little bit. That already sounds better. And I'm going to do a little bit more tinkering with the velocity. So the idea is the higher the velocity, the longer the notes will be, but using the attenuator, we're just going to get a little bit of a tail to each of the notes if we want. That sounds good. Again, just adjusting the VCA decay level, trying to find that sweet spot. Now, if I want a snare sound, I can use a negative envelope to modulate the filter. And as you hear, that brings the pitch of the noise down and it sounds more like a snare. For a fatter snare sound, can use longer envelope decay times. And if we want our hi-hats back, all we have to do is bring the filter modulation back to positive. Cool. Okay, let me show you something neat. We're going to make some bird sounds. So I'm using a molt cable of the velocity sequencer output, keeping our VCA decay envelope modulation happening, and I'm also going to modulate the VCO envelope decay, turning up the frequency of oscillator 1 and turning the attack of the VCA to slow. And now we got some birds. Okay, bird sounds are cool, but let's try something a little more useful. VCA back into fast attack mode, and we'll try a pulse wave from oscillator 1, turn down oscillator 1's frequency. And we'll make an adjustment with the filter. And now we've kind of got hi-hats and rototoms. You know, you don't see rototoms that much anymore. They used to be on pretty much every drummer's kit in the 80s. Okay, that's pretty much it. So now we've got our hi-hats with rototoms. We can play snare if we want by modulating the, by using negative filter envelope modulation. So I'm just going to play around a little bit, and then we'll move on to the next patch. All right, my camera died while filming the walkthrough for this patch, so I'm just going to talk through how I put it together. The idea for this one was to take advantage of the dual oscillators and wonderful FM on the DFAM and use the DFAM to create a melodic sequence instead of a percussive patch. It's another pretty simple patch, but let's talk through it. So the first step was to find oscillator sound I liked. So I didn't want to use hard sync, so I turned that off and turned up both oscillators to full in the mixer. You don't get the saturation you get from the Moog Matriarch, Subharmonicon, or many of the other Moog synths if you crank things up in the mixer, but you do get a little bit, enough for a nice warm buzz. I used triangle waves for both oscillators and tuned them in octaves, but they were slightly detuned to get a slight beating and chorusy effect. And the next step was to dial in some FM and find a sound I like. FM usually creates pretty bright sounds, so I set the cutoff on the low-pass filter to around 250 to tame those highs a little bit. Left the resonance at 0, but that might be a parameter I play around with later, especially with the filter cutoff so low. I want this patch to be punchy and take advantage of the DFAM's quick attack, so left the VCA attack on fast, but brought the VCA decay to about the midway point to let the notes ring. To keep some of that punch, I used a lot of filter envelope modulation but kept the VCF decay time short, so just the beginnings of the notes are a little bit brighter. Not going to use any other filter modulation, so kept the VCF mod amount at 0. Next step was to set up an 8-step pitch sequence. I'm going to go into a lot more detail about the DFAM sequencers in the next video, but for now, I'll just say the pitch sequencer can be very sensitive and difficult to tune if you want a melodic sequence. So instead of taking 30 minutes to step manually through and tune each step with a tuner, which you can do of course, I made sure the sequence pitch switch was not assigned to either sequencer and patched the pitch CV out to a quantizer. Had my quantizer set to a major scale and patched out of the quantizer to both oscillator pitch inputs. Unlike the subharmonicon, matriarch, or grandmother, the pitch inputs on the DFAM are not normaled, so it's necessary to patch into both if you want them both to track a sequence. If your quantizer doesn't have dual outs, you can of course simply molt it. Or you don't even have to use a quantizer, like I said, you can just step through each pitch and set it manually. Sometimes that works out really good. There's a great documentary I saw about the guys that made Stranger Things using a Roland sequencer. Anyway, that's for another time. Then I just played the sequencer and adjusted the steps on the pitch sequencer until I found something I liked. After that, I adjusted the velocity sequencer. Absolutely love the velocity sequencer for melodic patterns. Really helps it sound natural and brings static sequences to life. I really wish all Moog synths had something as easy to use as the DFAM velocity lane. Oh well. Okay, the rest was just icing on the cake. I used the keyboard from a Mother 32 to transpose my sequence by patching the KB out of the Mother into the shift input on my quantizer, which in this case is set to transpose things diatonically. Then I decided, since I'm already using the Mother 32, I should clock it by patching trigger out of the DFAM into the tempo input on the Mother 32. Then I used the random CV from the Mother's assign out to modulate the VCA decay time on the DFAM to get some more variation in the note lengths. You could of course use any random CV source for this, but the Mother was right there and it's easy enough to clock it, so the modulation sits well with the note lengths. Oh, since I wasn't using the VCO envelope generator to modulate either of the oscillators, I turned up the VCO envelope decay and patched the VCO envelope generator out to the noise level input on the DFAM. That gave me control over percussive snare or hat sound depending on the length of the VCO decay, which I could have modulated, but just played in real time. So that's the patch, a nice simple but interesting melodic sequence taking advantage of the DFAM's dual oscillators in FM. So although it's not a percussive drum patch, it's something you can't get on a Mother 32 or subharmonicon. Cool, let's hear how it sounds. Well, that about does it. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something. I'll continue this series on the DFAM over the next several weeks.